Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you watching from different places, and welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Erin Bremer. I'm a graduate assistant for the Zehr Institute. Unfortunately, for today, DeMointe Wesley, who is going to be our host, is unable to join us, so the Zehr Institute's Jonathan Swartz will be guiding our presentation instead, but I will start us off by going over our agenda for today. Jonathan will begin by introducing our guest speakers, giving a bit of context about them and their work. Their topic for today is Everyday RJ, moving from rhetoric to repair and resilience in ourselves and our communities. We want to note that everyone speaking will do their best to communicate in a manner so that you viewers can follow along, but please comment in the comment section of whatever platform you're using if you have any difficulty with the speed of our guests' conversation. Following their discussion, there will be time for our guests to answer questions from you all, moderated by Jonathan. Then after wrapping up the Q&A portion, I'll rejoin you briefly to share a bit about our March webinar. As always, you will be able to access the recording of this webinar via the Zehr Institute's website and our YouTube channel, which should be uploaded by the end of this week if you have to leave before the conclusion or if you'd like to share it with others. Thanks again, and I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to do some introductions.
Thanks, Erin, and good afternoon, morning, evening, day, wherever you are. It's good to see all of you. We're excited today for some conversation with two of our favorite colleagues. First, introduce Dr. D, Desirée Anderson. Desirée was born in San Diego, California. She earned her BA and M.Ed from the University of Louisville and her PhD from the University of New Orleans, studying the use of campus-based restorative justice approaches as a response to racially motivated bias incidents. Dr. Anderson is the Dean of Equity and Inclusion at Prairie State College. She previously held positions at the University of New Orleans, St. Mary's College of California, Tulane University, and Texas State University. Desirée serves as an adjunct instructor and RJ trainer and facilitator. She's released book chapters in Colorizing Restorative Justice, Ethics in Higher Education, and Applying Restorative Justice to Campus Sexual Misconduct, a guide to emerging practices, and founded Lord and Liberation, Building Transformative Solutions, LLC. She watches an unnecessary amount of K-dramas in her free time. Good to see you today, Desirée, and we're looking forward to what you will bring to our conversation. Also like to introduce Josh Bacon. Josh Bacon, a former screw-up who was able to keep pulling himself back up from the many storms in his life to eventually serve thousands of other people and help them learn how to rise from the setbacks of their lives. Josh served as an administrator for over 20 years at James Madison University, recently retiring in 2020 as their Dean of Students. Josh also served as a faculty member at the university and co-directed the College Student Personnel Administration Master's Program. Josh has a PhD in Educational Leadership from Clemson University and a Master's in Education Administration from Salisbury University. Josh consults with colleges about implementation of restorative justice practices. Josh currently resides in Lacey Springs, Virginia, with his wife and 3 daughters. It's good to see you again, Josh, as well. Looking forward to what you will bring for us. Want to remind us all, topic for today, Everyday RJ, moving from rhetoric to repair and resilience in ourselves and our communities. And a reminder to those of you watching from StreamYard or from YouTube, please feel free to put comments or observations or questions in the comments section of the platform that you are watching, and we will get a chance to engage some of those comments and questions towards the end of our time together. What we're going to do next is simply invite each of our guests to share with us from their topical areas, from their writing, from their experience. We're going to have Dr. Desirée go first, and then we'll have Dr. Bacon go after that. So Desirée, I will take Josh and I out of this studio and let you go for it.
Sound good. So thank you all for joining the webinar today, and thank you to the Zehr Institute for inviting me to participate in this conversation, which I think is really important. I came into this work in 2013-ish, really at the height of my doctoral studies. I was studying something completely different, and really got introduced to, I think, work I was already doing, but now being able to put a name to it. And as I continue to engage in my own research, education, training, and facilitation, and especially in working with other communities and pockets of people, I started recognizing this pattern. And I really came into this work of what restorative justice is to me, this kind of like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, if you will, just so in love with what restorative justice could be as a liberatory practice. And as I have engaged in it, I've recognized a need. And that need does not diminish my love and appreciation for what this work is and can be for so many communities of people. But it's a need that I think we have to sometimes take some step back and hearken to what's the integrity of this work. And so this topic, I think, for me is really important. Is like, how do we engage with restorative justice in the everyday way? I think too often we're so focused on getting the good outcome that we fail to really think about the process by which we get to those outcomes. We're looking too far ahead and we're forgetting about some of the small things that we really need. And so much of my work over the past, almost 10 years has been about that. You could start to see that in my work in Colorizing Restorative Justice, where I was really focusing on this concept of co-opting restorative justice in higher education, specifically because that's where I mostly do my work. But I think this is applicable to a variety of spaces and communities. And what I mean by this idea of co-opting or needing to get to the nitty-gritty, the mundane of this work, is that we often are looking to try to make sure that people are happy. And it's hard to do that if we're not really paying attention to the small details. And so I'm really glad that we are going to be engaging with Dr. Bacon as well, who's really spending a lot of time thinking about the self. What is the role of self in this work as well? How are we doing restorative justice for ourselves? So let me take a step back for a second and think about, what does this look like? What does it look like to engage in these everyday practices to get to the nitty gritty? And so the first thing really is about maintaining that integrity. This work follows, it has a history, right? This idea of community. And I think too often we are engaging in this practice without the lens of community. We are rushing in to try to repair relationships that didn't actually exist in the first place. So you will hear me say, I don't know how many times, that the majority of the work that you should be doing with restorative justice should be centered around building community, building relationships. And I know this is things that you have heard before, but I think it's important to just reiterate that the vast majority of the work that you all should be engaging with when you are putting forth these restorative practices is how are we building relationships? And this is important because we get into things like in our own biases, things like gatekeeping or net widening, which I'll talk about here in a second. If we're not really conscious of who is in our communities, right? What is the framework of our community? What do our communities actually look like? Are they already fractured before we even try to do some rebuilding? Did we actually have the right relationships to begin to try to rebuild? Then we're going into trying to repair something that was never put together in the first place. So we have to spend a good amount of our time really emphasizing the role of relationships, right? Because that's what restorative justice is. It's about repairing relationships. Excuse me. And I think in some ways we have this idealized idea that restorative justice will fix the things. What restorative justice does really is creates a container for us to be able to do that mending, but we ourselves have to do the work in this space. So how are we checking ourselves to make sure we are conscious of the biases perhaps that we hold with the community that we're engaging with if we're the facilitator. If I'm the person who's been impacted, or if I'm the person who's caused harm, what are the things that maybe I'm holding or I believe about the other person or the community that they belong to that I have not done a lot of interrogation around? Because that's going to show up in how I choose to forgive or how I choose to try to hold myself accountable for that. If I'm not conscious of the biases that I have about other communities, the people in front of me, that's going to show up in the work that I do. If I am the facilitator, if I am not conscious of the way that the things that maybe trigger me, or the excuse me, or the biases that I have, then I might engage in what we would say is like net whining or gatekeeping. So net whining is, particularly thinking about this in like a K-12 setting, where one student who engaged in this behavior, you would simply say, don't do it again, give a warning. Whereas for another student, you might decide that they need to go through this very intensive restorative process, right? Opening them up to more scrutiny than you maybe would for another. On the flip side of that, this idea of gatekeeping, that we would limit who has access to this. So on the one hand, you have a student who you would say maybe really needs this, and you're not going to offer it to them because they're not from the right community. They don't have the right community that they belong to feel like they're worthy, if you will, right? We've cast some judgment on their worthiness to engage in this type of accountability work. So we have to really do some of that within ourselves. So Josh's work that he does around doing restorative justice within itself can be really helpful to thinking about how do we do this for ourselves so that we're conscious of how we're showing up, whatever role we're playing in that. So that's one of the first things that we really have to do when you're thinking about this everyday RJ. How am I showing up in the space, and how might that be impacting what's happening in the work that we're doing as a collective body? The other piece is really, excuse me, is recognizing the limitations of your personnel. I will often talk about this when you are engaging in restorative practices, is that not everybody has to do everything. If you have a team of people, there are going to be some people who are really good at the facilitator piece. They're really good at being able to hold space for other people. And then there's other people who are going to be really great at being able to sell the story of restorative justice, being able to communicate what it is and what it is not. And this is going to be really important because the other big aspect of our everyday practices is how are we reorienting people to our ideas of justice? And what I mean by that is people often see restorative justice, and I'm sure some of you have maybe heard this before, this idea that it is this kumbaya type of thing, that it is it's too soft, or it's not punishing someone enough. And so part of our work as we engage in the mundane of this is how are we communicating what accountability is and is not, what justice looks like, what it does not, in our various spaces. So it becomes really important that we get people to be on the same page and to understand what it actually looks like to hold somebody accountable, and how is it different from what our traditional justice systems look like. So how are we engaging in a conversation with people so that they're really understanding the power of this type of accountability and its long-term effects, and that it's not this kind of easy fix that people sometimes assume that it is, that it actually is a lot of hard work. And the more that you can engage people by helping them understand the story of restorative justice, the more people are going to buy into it, and the more that they're going to invest into doing the work of restorative justice. Because if they're not invested in it, if they're not buying in it, then they're also trying to quickly fix something or move too fast through the process, that we are missing some of the integral spots and processes in doing the work well. Asking the who and the why. Why are we doing this? And who are we doing this for? So how are we really holding our systems accountable for when and where we are applying these restorative practices, And how and who and why are we engaging in this in the first place? Is it to cover ourselves because we don't want ourselves to look bad? Or is it to really understand exactly the community that has been impacted and how we're going to show up for them to do that kind of healing? And I would say that the way that we often practice restorative justice now, when I talk about this idea of focusing on process more than the outcomes, is for a couple of reasons. But the big reason is that you're not always going to get the outcome you want. But so often what we will find when we do the work well is that even when people are not necessarily satisfied with the exact outcome that we can come to, when we're thinking about agreements or we're thinking about some type of restitution, they are very happy, if you will, with the process, because we have followed a thing where they feel like it was procedurally fair, where they had voice, where they had, some role in determining what that outcome will be. So the outcome may not be the exact thing that everybody wanted, but as long as we are really being mindful of the steps that we're taking along the way, then we're able to really get people to a place where they're still satisfied with that. And there is a sense of healing, there is a sense of community and camaraderie that can still be built from that work. And then the last thing I'll kind of talk about is this idea of the system piece. And then I will definitely open up for some questions in this. And so when we think about restorative justice being something that is system-wide, right? So what levels are we engaging with this and who's all involved in it? If it's only happening in one space, you're not really doing restorative justice work, right? You're maybe doing some practices, you're doing some elements, but it has to happen at every single level of our institutions, whether you're in K-12, higher education, a nonprofit organization, et cetera. How deeply embedded is this restorative work in happening in your institutions? Are you engaging in community building circles or check-in questions? Are you doing the work to engage people in building interpersonal relationships? Are you setting and creating community values and expectations? Are you embedding this as a way to address conflict and harm and giving people the tools to use it amongst themselves? Or is it becoming something that is kind of held up here and only utilized by a select few group of people? So when we talk about this idea of moving from rhetoric to repair, for me, it's really thinking about all of the little small things that we have to do. So what work are we doing within ourselves to understand our own biases, our triggers, how good we are or not with facilitating? Who and why are we doing this? And what does that community look like? How are we building relationships? Are we being intentional about that? And how are we communicating that? How are we communicating exactly what justice and accountability looks like in different spaces? And how are we bringing people in to the fold of understanding what that means so that they are buying into these systems and practices? And then how are we embedding it into our actual systems? How are we being sure that restorative justice is not just this thing that we do, but it's something that is, right? It is a part of our structures, right? And not just this thing that we do. So I will stop there. And I think Jonathan has a few questions for me, and then we'll go to Dr. Bacon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Desiree, for that invitation to the like a properly critical look at our practice and at our systems, even as we recognize the promise of restorative justice. That's something that I really have valued about my own mentor in this work, Howard Zehr. He always paired like the promise of RJ with the challenge of RJ, right? Like, and those two belong together, if for many reasons, but if only really important for accountability of those of us who would attempt practice, right? I would what you were saying reminded me of this. It's a quote from Dennis Sullivan and Larry Tift, I think, and it's in their book Restorative Justice: Healing the Foundations of Our Everyday Lives. And they're talking about defining restorative justice. And I'm just going to share this quote and then just ask for your kind of like any comments that you have on hearing this. But so they say, whatever definition we come up with and whatever conclusions we draw, we will see that how we view and define restorative justice will be derived primarily from how we view and define our relationships with each other in our daily lives. That is, by the political economy of relationships we live by the impulses that shape our sense of loss and gain, and by the steps we take to avoid and embrace each other in the worst as well as the best of times. For me, that kind of like connects this sort of very personal, our everyday lives to this very big, like political economy of relationships, right? What comes up for you as you hear that? Yeah, as you hear that quote.
Yeah, I think actually to your point, right, is think about, this, we often hear this idea like living restoratively, right? And so I think it is this, to your point around the how are we living it every day? If I will admit, my road rage is real. It's like the one area of my life where I try so hard to be empathetic and compassionate and calm, and it just hasn't worked for me just yet. Right. But if I think about this in the grand scheme of my everyday work, if I am not showing up doing the, with empathy when I'm engaging with people, even when I'm not in a restorative process, am I actually doing restorative justice? Right? Am I really thinking about the role of relationships? And so I think this idea of the role of relationships becomes really crucial to the work that we do as restorative justice practitioners and facilitators and whoever else, is that when we think about, I did a presentation with our faculty here for the ALCA faculty orientation, and one of the things I said to them, and I think this applies, is when you're engaging with students, sometimes we get a little frustrated, and I think about if this was your favorite student, how would you engage with that student differently than you would with this other student? Right? Because we're often more inclined to ask additional questions. We might be more inclined to think of a million other possibilities as to why this student showed up late or didn't do this assignment or blah, 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 because that's a good student. They would never do this, right? And so how can we use that same principle when we are engaging with people in our everyday life, right? Even if you don't know all of the values and principles of restorative justice, we can think about relationship building through that lens of, if this was my favorite student, how would I engage with them? What questions would I want to ask? And so I think the practice of leading into restorative justice and leading in this every day is, how are we, what questions are we asking and what questions are we not asking sometimes? And I think that's what that quote really reminds me is to lean into what are we asking of people and what space are we giving them to give us the answer?
Yeah. And I've been reminded recently too of this, like this because of the kind of kumbaya-ish views of restorative justice that kind of exist in the ether. It can sometimes feel like the main goal in being restorative is just be nice, just be really kind, right? And so like I think there's a piece there where it's like, yes, and also remember that we're talking about justice here, and justice doesn't just happen when people are nice, right? There needs to be other, there have to be other factors, dynamics that we bring in into the goal. Being restorative just isn't encompassed by just be kind, be nice, right? Love it. It looks like there is a question which I'm going to suggest that we come back to later after we hear Josh. Thank you, Dr. D. We'll be in conversation after a little bit. I'm going to bring Josh onto the live stream here, and just invite Josh to share with us what you've got, and then we'll engage in some conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. And Dr. Anderson, thank you, boy. You set me up there. And I love listening to your work and what you do. But when you talk about relationships, and you talk about self, and that's kind of where I've progressed with restorative justice in terms of restoring yourself. Let me tell you how I got there. Well, I guess it's probably 15 years ago where I got introduced to restorative justice, and I took classes at EMU, took classes with Howard Zehr, and I loved everything about it. It fit me, it fit my faith. I got so excited, I took every class I could, and probably like many of you, read every book I could, started talking about it, started learning about it, and ran back to my home institution, James Madison University, and started talking about it and realizing nobody there even knew what it was. And so many of us have started there when we go back to work at different organizations, institutions, colleges, whatever it may be, school systems. But where I started to get to this restorative self-care really came from kind of frustration. And this was after doing restorative work and bringing it to JMU and developing a system there and a process, and then starting to consult with other colleges, and then starting to expand to work with the criminal justice system and in our own community. And really the frustration was, and many of you who do this work know, when you talk to people and you train people and you get people excited and they go back and you check in later, whether it's a few months later, years later, restorative justice always seems to be just a little piece, just a little bit, they couldn't get going. And then I remember even some institutions, I would do a training and get called back 5 years and really start all over. Oh, the people who were into it left, everyone's gone. And that happened at a couple institutions, really going back to start kind of from square one, and particularly with the criminal justice system, just not seeing it take off and just getting small bits and small deferments, and only with juvenile, and you all know what I'm talking about to do this work. But let me go back to kind of the end of my career. When I retired, I was able to retire early. And to me, I wanted to experience law enforcement and understand what was going on in their world, with everything going on in law enforcement, all the things we were seeing and hearing. I kind of wanted to see what it was like to walk in their shoes. So I went and became a safety officer at Bridgewater College, and they convinced me to go to the police academy. So I learned a little bit. Again, I've never been a police officer, but I've learned a little bit about their culture. And that's where I really started to understand the officers I worked with and the mental health training of law enforcement, that officers are traumatized. Their experiences and what they go through, they're often traumatized. They were clearly understaffed, felt like they were underpaid. The mental health training of the academy, the theme was, it is what it is. And I remember thinking for the years and the frustrations with restorative justice, after experiencing that, to them, this was like one more thing you got to do, that we're understaffed. We're just trying to do calls. We're traumatized, we're stressed, all these different things. And it helped me understand a little bit of maybe taking restorative self-care for students, for faculty, for staff, for law enforcement, for everybody. And let me go back to, I think what really put that towards my end of career at JMU, I was dean of students, and restorative justice was still under my purview, but really the bulk of my time and the bulk of institution's time was this anxiety and depression. And people know, especially this was during COVID, that's all we dealt with. Over 50% of students have anxiety and depression. And that those numbers are somewhat skewed and probably even higher because of underreported and since COVID. So I remember researching and looking everything I could about how to combat that and what to do. And the number one thing that kept coming up, especially in higher education, was sharing. That students need to share, that they don't share their struggles. That as many of you all know, our phones and social media, we share our best selves, the best version of ourselves, and we're worried about likes and things like that, and it actually creates more anxiety and things like that. So I remember looking into it and seeing how could we develop programs to share. And one this really kind of hit home for me with Dean of Students. A very common situation is someone would knock on my door And no matter what was going on in the day, if a student knocked on the door, we stopped everything and met with them. And they'd come in and they'd be sobbing, and they'd tell me they want to withdraw from the university. And just like with restorative practices, I'd ask, tell me your story, because I was trying to use restorative language and restorative mindset. How were you harmed? What's going on? Tell me your story. And they would tell me a very common situation. Well, I want to be a nurse, for example. I've always wanted to be a nurse and help people. And I came here to JMU, and I took my first biology class, and I failed the first quiz. And I was thinking, you want to drop out? Yeah, I can't be a nurse. I failed. I don't know what to do. I'm a failure. Well, and most of you all probably know, this is the beginning of your career. This is one class. This is one quiz. But I started to realize students didn't have a practice and a system, a lot of students, to address failure and setbacks as well as conflict. And that's when I started to look at the things that worked over time. And I started to think about my experiences with law enforcement later on. And that's where I started to apply restorative practices to kind of self-care. One of the things with sharing that stands out to me, I remember one of the very first restorative circles I did at JMU, and this was a long time ago. I got a call, and those of you who work on college campuses or who did conduct might find this familiar. I got a call. They say there was a fight on campus. It was 2 a.m. I woken up. They said 10 football players got in a fight with each other. You need to come to campus right away. So I drove to campus, got there, and there was, you would have thought, a SWAT team, police everywhere. Residence halls cleared out. 10 large football players get in a fight in their suite. It creates quite a disruption. So I remember going in with the police and talking with some of the harm parties and the people who did the harm, and it was football players against football players. And they asked them, do you want to press criminal charges against each other? And you can imagine they said, no, we're not pressing charges against our fellow players. Okay, well, we have a conduct process. I explained the process. Do you want to press conduct charges? They didn't want to do that either. Well, I remember I was learning about restorative justice. That's what I was thinking about. That's where my mind was. So we got things settled for the night. And the next day we had a meeting with all the administration, attorneys, chief of police, vice presidents. What are we going to do? Well, we look at kind of our normal language. Well, there's no evidence. We don't know who did what, and we don't know what policy violations were. So we didn't seem to have much to go on. So I said, this was kind of a leap at the time. Well, there's something called restorative justice, and this is what it would look like. And maybe we get these guys together, and we could try it. And I remember very clearly the attorney and the chief of police are like, "Are you kidding me? You're going to get it?" And you heard Desiree talk about kumbaya. Are you going to get a bunch of football players to sit in a circle and talk about their feelings and emotions and what happened? You got to be kidding me. But they were willing to try it because at that time there was no alternative based on evidence and things like that. So I remember during the first circle, I was thinking, I was used to conduct and sitting behind a big desk in the normal traditional way of sanctioning students and punishing students. So I was like, we're not going to sit in a circle with nothing in between. We don't need to do that. And then I just remember Howard Zehr ringing in my ear, embrace the process. So I did. I set up the circle. We used a talking piece, and the first round was relationship building, where you share something about yourself that no one else knows, because these were teammates who knew each other really well. And I role modeled, and I went first, and I shared. I played football in college, and I've been to jail twice in my life, and different experiences they probably weren't expecting from the director of student conduct. And I passed the talking piece to the next person, and he said, my dad's an alcoholic. It beats my mom on a regular basis. He passed the circle, and it went around a couple more times, and a student said, I'm addicted to painkillers. Passed it around, another student said, I've been adopted by 3 different sets of parents in my life. And it got back to me. And those of you who do conduct, we don't hear those kind of things in a conduct meeting where you're sanctioning and punishing students. And I remember, obviously, we finished the circle and addressed the issues and things like that. But all 3 of those students came up to me afterwards and said, I've never told anyone that before, and I don't know why I did now. So hindsight to when I retired, I started to make the connection of sharing. How do you get students to share? And that's when I thought restorative practices, creating that space, creating that container. It's not being done with technology and social media. The restorative practices has a role in anxiety and depression by getting students to share. So we started a program, and this was, very in my last year and a half at the university, where we brought in students who were struggling, either through the Dean of Students Office, conduct, and even academics. And we did restorative journaling, restorative mentoring, and restorative circles. And what was kind of unique about it, and really focusing on what I would call restorative self-care, is we looked at all areas of wellness. And for those who work in higher ed and student development theory, there are the 7 areas of wellness: physical, spiritual, emotional, financial, intellectual, social, and environmental. Now, when you work with students, a lot of students think of self-care as just the physical. Oh, I work out all the time, or oh, I eat right, things like that. But looking at all areas of self-care and having them put them under the pillars of restorative practices. And what this means is how have you harmed yourself? Take financial, for example. What are the harms you've done to yourself financially or happened to you financially? What are your needs financially? And what are your obligations? How do you make things right, or what do you need to do moving forward? And how do you engage in this? And what we found is some students could journal about it. That's how they wanted to share. They weren't ready to talk to another person, and they certainly weren't ready to talk in a circle. But some students wouldn't dream of journaling. Now, I'm not going to sit down and write there. I've never done that. So they would mentor, and one-on-one, we talk about all those areas of wellness and how to make things right, or we do it in a circle process. But by the end, they were doing all 3. And when we assessed that, and we only did one pilot, and I wish we could have done more, but it was off the charts in terms of, and we talk about resiliency and grit, and academic resiliency and emotional wellness. All students' numbers were going up when we did that. So to me, that's what I mean by restorative self-care. And to me, it's very hard when I think now I've gone back to working with the criminal system and working with law enforcement in an administrative capacity. And to me, to start with, okay, let's look on restorative self-care for the law enforcement, where they can start using that language of harms, needs, obligations, and start taking care of themselves. Then they start to use it in a group setting within the department. Then they can start use it to build relationships with the community. And then, and only then after that, start dealing it with conflict. And then, and only then, the highest level, when there's criminal charges and there's diversions. I think too many times I've seen from consulting, both in higher ed and the criminal justice system, so we try to jump right to the highest level cases, to major conflicts. And when you go back and you ask them, how many cases did you have? It's just a couple. It's just 1 or 2, or, oh, it's not working. It's this and that. What I found, and what we did at JMU, we started to use the language with every kind of case we had. Students started to learn about harms, needs, and obligations. So when we asked them how many restorative justice cases you had, it wasn't 1 or 2, it was thousands. Every single student who came into our office learned restorative practices. So to me, there's a program we developed, and I'll stop after this. It was called Rebound at JMU, which is about storytelling. It's about when you struggle, when you fail, and you have setbacks, those actually make you wiser and stronger, and you're not to be ashamed of it. So we had students who learned through restorative practices that language, and if they wanted to, they shared their stories. You can go to JMU's website, and they're called Rebound videos, powerful stories of students, faculty, staff, coaches, athletes, sharing their stories of struggles, and you'll love, and I love hearing it because they use the restorative language too. And hopefully you become a community, not only with conflict, but you embrace the restorative practices when you struggle, and that's how you move forward and make meaning of your struggles. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Josh, for telling stories. the influence of stories and experience as we share them in the context of relationship holds the capacity to change. I just have like one question. When you say restorative journaling or restorative mentoring, what makes that restorative? Like
Yep.
for
Question.
mentoring, for example, what is the what does
Yep.
restorative mean in that qualifier?
So to me, with restorative practice, you're creating a different space by first developing that relationship over time. And then you're using the language where you're starting to use harms, needs, and obligations in terms of your mentoring. And same thing with your journaling prompts. Um, is you're asking them to look at their self-care from a restorative lens is really the difference. And what I love, and particularly with college students, at least the population that I worked with, a lot of them, people would always use the word entitlement. And if you work in higher ed, most people hear that. And not all, but some students are entitled and feel entitled. And I constantly tried to think about, how do you counter that? What's the opposite of entitlement? And then I was like, restorative justice, obligations. It's exactly opposite, not what you get. It's what are you supposed to do? How do you make things as right as possible? So when students are struggling, it's not that, their parents calling and saying, how can you help them? What do they get? How do you get them out of this? It's what are my obligations? So it's flipping that language. And when you talk about restorative mentoring, you're talking about how you're going to make this right. And then you can help them develop a process that they can look at their future struggles from, okay, what are my harms? What do I need? I struggled or I failed. What do I need moving forward? What are my obligations to make this right, make myself right? How can I now look at all areas of wellness, make myself right? And then to me, they go into the next struggle or the next challenge with a different mindset, with a restorative mindset that I may struggle, and that's okay because I have a process to recover. And it can be, I can go back to my journal if I'm comfortable with that and analyze it and make meaning of it. I can go meet with a mentor and make meaning of it. Or to me, if you're creating a system, you're doing all three. You're having a circle process, and that's especially with students where you have them helping each other instead of a mentor or an administrator telling them and talking about this stuff. I think it blows it all away. But if you can do all three, then to me, they're living restoratively.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you for that. Desirée, I think I'm going to add you back into the stream here, and would first want to invite anything that the two of you heard from each other that generated a question for you, and maybe I'll give you a second to think about that. But really, there's a number of really insightful comments and questions in our comments, and want to invite folks to keep putting more there. But I'm going to put this one from Sarah Maddox on the screen for just a second here, because I think there's connections here between some of the systemic and the personal sorts of things. But Sarah's question here: in my everyday life, I think a lot about slowing down, and of course, there's a direct tension with capitalist structures of providing for myself and those closest to me. Of course, everyone is experiencing the press of the urgency of the now. So, care to comment? How can we encourage folks to opt into deep collective care, even though working within systems that are not designed for it? Either of you care to comment on that?
I'll chime in quickly, just because this is something that's on my mind as we were talking about that before we hopped on, right? Like, if you all have learned, I'm working 2 jobs, and so capitalism, yay! But I think part of it is thinking about this idea, like this deep collective. So I engage in a couple of small practices for myself. So I make some restrictions on when I will and when I won't work. And so for me, Saturdays are always off the book. I do not work on Saturdays because that is like the one day I can give myself to do whatever it is I need to do for myself. But then I also have a few people who I kind of keep, they're like my circle keepers that I engage with. And so in particular, some of you all will know Jasmine's Story. They are another practitioner, and we pretty much have every Friday tea time where we meet up for an hour or so to decompress and to hold space for each other. And to talk about Korean dramas. That's part of our joy. And I think, when we're in systems, we're always competing for different things, because it'll be like you have paid time off, but if you use your paid time off, then sometimes people will be like, you're not working hard enough, or we don't have a lot of those third spaces that we used to have where you could engage in building community and relationships that didn't cost you money. And so we're constantly battling those different things. And I think part of it is how can you develop intentional relationships with the people you already have in your life? So how do you develop that type of community container with those people to help you figure out what is good for you? Because everyone's self-care is different. Some people are the folks who want to do the massage, go to the beach type of stuff. For me, it is sitting in my bed and doing nothing. And how can I be in community with other people? So sometimes I have another friend and we just get on Zoom and we don't actually talk to each other, but it's like, body doubling, if you will, to just be in community with someone. And so I think it's finding those and developing the intentionalness with the people you're already in community with.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add too, kind of, what I talked about before, that you could teach it in college. You could teach these restorative practices. You can have them practice restorative journaling, restorative mentoring. But again, if they have that restorative language now, and they've learned to look at their wellness, all areas of wellness, when it's out of line, or they talk with a mentor, oh, so how is your spiritual wellness now? And they go, oh, I haven't done anything recently, or that's why I'm feeling this way, or tell me about your harms and your needs. If they get in the habit of doing that in college, and hopefully they take that with them and they can monitor it, and the hope would be they're much more aware of their needs and their obligations. And when you're more aware of your obligations, you can say no. You could say, I have an obligation to my environment, intellectually or physically, that I'm going to say no to this because I know it'll harm me in the future. Again, we've got to give them that language and teach people how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm gonna thank you both for those comments. I want to put up Virginia Swain's comment here of this. There's a context to all of this, right? The context of racism, intrinsic, systemic, structural violence against people of color, misogyny within our bureaucracies, institutions, corporate systems, that necessarily impact how restorative justice, restorative practices works. How do we account for those as we think about restorative justice in our everyday lives?
Josh, you want to start?
I'll say quickly, and then I definitely want to hear what you have to say about this. Where I've come to, especially with working in higher ed and criminal justice systems, that they resist restorative justice to some degree, and that's how I know restorative justice works and is good. Especially the criminal justice system, which is so embedded in institutions and so financially motivated, that they're threatened by restorative justice. If they weren't, they wouldn't care, and they would let it grow, and they would let it move into different areas. And anyone who's worked with restorative justice and justice systems knows that it's a struggle and that it's hard. So to me, it's pushing up against those systems, those racist and misogynistic systems. I haven't figured out the answer, how to move beyond that. I just know that we need to.
Yeah, I mean, as I was kind of talking about when I was in my first kind of opening piece, is this idea that, to Josh's point, restorative justice really can be a vehicle and a tool and a container to be able to address these types of issues in our systems and our society. And we cannot assume that just because it's a container that can allow it to happen, that those things, right, misogyny, racism, xenophobia, all are not going to be inside that container. And so how can we be intentional about, again, what work we're doing as the facilitators who are holding those spaces for people? What type of training are we doing? Again, we talk about, is it embedded in your full system or is it not, right? And so my last institution I was at that institution for 4 years. We did not have restorative practices or restorative justice there because we did not have the structural system yet, right? I was working on building that to be able to put it, and I was not going to put these practices into a system that was not going to be able to hold it. So there are things I obviously personally did with my work, the way that I showed up to use these restorative justice principles and elements in my work, but I would never call the work that I was doing as restorative justice because it was not this deeply embedded in system space, because we didn't have it at all of these different levels. And so when I think about this idea of addressing intrinsic, racism, violence against people of color, misogyny, etc., in our institutions, is to think about, why is there the resistance in the first place? Again, going back to this idea of the relationship. So how are we communicating the importance of building those relationships to be able to break down all of these other things? Because if personally, we recognize how humans work. If they cannot care about people in these other communities, right, that they're not a part of, or that they're uplifting, or the systems that they're upholding, they're not going to find a reason to not do those things. Right? So part of it is going back to this idea of, I don't want to hurt people in my community, but that means I have to care about the people in my community to want to change systems, to be able to want to think about how everything is not just best for me, right? How do we get back to this idea of a collectivism as opposed to individualism, right? And so we're competing against a Western societal culture that is heavily emphasizing individualism. And yet we're engaging in a practice that is heavily emphasizing collectivism. So how do we merge these two things together? So again, I go back to, we got to do the work of actually thinking about, what is community? How do we build community? And it's only really through that, for me personally, that this will actually do the work of addressing intrinsic racism, misogyny, etc. Because if people don't care, they don't care. So we got to get people to care, right? We got to see it as, your value, your worth is tied to my value, my worth. Your upliftment isn't tied to my upliftment. I can't be up here if you're down here. So how do we get people to understand that these things are connected together? And that's really hard, because we're battling against long histories of people who know that they're struggling, but as long as I'm not struggling as bad as you, right? There's still that mentality. And so how do we combat that? And really, for me, it is, how do we make people human? How do we make people human to other people?
John, can I add one more thing to that?
Go for it.
And I'm looking at Adam Lindbergh's question about data points too. One of the studies, I think it was the University of Vermont, and David Karp did, where they used circle processes to build community in the resident's life. And to Desiree's point, one of the things they saw go up was empathy. And to me, you're creating that space where you can share, deeply. You can be your authentic self. And when you start to share deeply, you start to understand the other and the different people's perspective. And when they assessed that, it developed, empathy went up in first year students from going through that experience. So to me, higher is just one vehicle, but schools and other places using those practices, using circle processes in different spaces where people can share and be their authentic self and start to understand the other and the differences and the commonalities, and you develop empathy, and you become more human. To me, everything else going on in society with technology and social media is quite honestly the exact opposite of that. So it is an uphill struggle, but it works, and we need to do more assessment to show these institutions where it is our goals and objectives to do this type of stuff. We need to implement the practices.
Yeah, I'll quickly add to that for Adam's question. And so I think, yes, you're going to see some quantitative stuff, right, around the ideas of like recidivism in our criminal justice systems as data points. But I would, particularly for those of us who work in like education, for me, what I think are kind of those data points are going to be a couple things, mostly around the qualitative, obviously, right? Like what are people saying about their experience when they're engaging with it? But I also think it is two other things. One is, how are people utilizing the skills that they're developing while they're participating in this in their own lives, right? So are they engaging in it enough? So I didn't tell the story at the beginning, but one of the the time that I was so sold on this process, I did some training with the Center for Restorative Approaches in New Orleans, and then I did some observational work for about a year at a non-traditional high school. And there were two girls in this hallway getting ready to get into a physical fight. And one of them, like, she pulled her arm back, ready to swing. And then she just took a deep breath and was like, we need a circle. And I was like, what did I just witness? And the other girl was like, yeah, I'm about to go get Mr. Evans. Like, she was still upset, but it was like, I'm gonna go get Mr. Evans. And so they did. They went and got Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans got the floating teacher to cover the class because that's who they trusted. And then they went and he facilitated this conversation for them because they knew that they had another tool, right? And so when people recognize that they have another tool, they use it. The other thing I would say is that when it's facilitated enough or they're experiencing enough, and again, when I go back to this idea of how are we reorienting people's ideas to what justice and accountability look like, then when students themselves cause harm, they will seek out people to help them facilitate that accountability. So again, when I was working at St. Mary's, we had started doing some work in our residence halls, and a student had an incident when they said something they shouldn't have said on a way to a debate competition. And they sought me out when they got back. They're like, Dr. D, they did not say messed up. They used a foul word, but that's okay. They're comfortable, right? They're like, up. And I need to figure out how I can make this right. Can you help me facilitate this restorative process so I can apologize, so I can take ownership for how I messed up this relationship? And so for me, I see those as huge wins, as big data points to show that when you give people the tools and they see it as something valuable, they themselves will use it or see it as a platform to do that amends work. And so, yes, we do need that quantitative hard data stuff. But for me personally, I'm like, yeah, give me the qualitative. give me the stuff over here.
Yeah. The data points are the stories, are the the qualitative pieces. I think this kind of coheres here. The question about, let's see, it's Andrew's first, the first question that came through, the first comment that came through from Andrew. School administrators and teachers often responding to crises all day, are overscheduled and or aren't open to doing the work themselves. Any advice on building relationships with adults in schools to support the goal of integrating restorative practices into their systems? So so much of our minds, especially in education systems, and if we're the adults, we so much think about, well, what are we doing for students or to students, right? But how is all of this impacting students? And what I love about Andrew's question is it's kind of pointing to this, well, hold on, how are we treating our colleagues? How are we doing this with others? With the direct theory of change that what we do actually impacts students too, not just the other way around. But yet, would either one of you comment on on this piece of what about relationships and how we do this amongst colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, that you do it, you do it with that group of people, right? So I think in some ways, right, starting off small. So at every place since I've been engaged in this work, I start with with our agendas, right? So doing some check-in questions, right? Just starting there, real simple. And sometimes it seems so odd for people, but yet they're so quick to engage, because people are not asking random things like, if your week was a movie, what would be the title? Like, being able to start with these kind of small things, and then being able to use the practices themselves amongst your team. So how are you maybe using restorative processes, using the circle form to hold your meetings, to gather ideas as a collective team, right? So if we've got to make a decision as the teaching staff, well, let's do it in a circle, right? Let's use a circle process to pack through, what are we thinking about this thing? What are the ideas, again, the connection, collaboration, concern, right? All of those things, putting it together. And so even if we're not calling it restorative justice, I often don't start by calling the work that I'm doing restorative justice. We're just doing this thing. Mm-hmm. And then when they're like, "Ooh, I like this. I like the way we do it," I'm like, "Great. This is actually a practice within restorative justice," mm-hmm. right? So getting them themselves to engage in, even in the smallest ways, so they can start to see how it works amongst themselves. And if they can start to see how it works amongst themselves, then it becomes a lot easier to convince them to then do the same thing with the students. So mm-hmm. how can you then incorporate what we just did in your own classroom, right? How do we just incorporate, again, small things? So we similarly, when I was at St. Mary's, we had, a couple of pilot faculty using just check-in questions with their class. And started doing that. It was a seminar-based course where they engage in discussion questions around texts that are around, like Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, Japanese internment camps, indigenous, colonization of indigenous communities, right? So they're talking about heavy topics, but by incorporating these little kind of check-in questions at the beginning, it helped create that foundation for people to feel a little bit more comfortable about what they were sharing, because they felt a little bit closer to the people. They also then read how people talked about things differently, right? Because same way, like sometimes you read emails with the attitude that maybe isn't there because you're making assumptions about people. It's the same way when we're in, we're face to face. Sometimes we are assuming something about a person or what they believe based off of what we perceive of them. And then we are interpreting what they're saying through that lens. But by giving people the opportunity to know each other in these very mundane, kind of odd ways, we reinterpret sometimes what we are hearing the person say. Mm-hmm. We're now seeing it through this lens of, I understand how this person thinks a little bit deeper, or I learned this piece about their background. And so the way that I'm now interpreting what they just said is different. So for me, I say it's really, how can you incorporate these practices with that team of people that they then turn around and hopefully will do that work with their students?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Josh, did you have any thoughts on that question?
I think that Desiree is right on. I think the one thing I'd reemphasize is, and some people have been trained this way, is they feel like they've got to have a big case, that they can't use it unless there's a giant conflict or a good community issue. And that's stressful and that's not easy. And to think that sometimes it keeps people from getting started. But what Desiree said, you start doing it. And when we do training, and you all know, and hopefully a lot of people know and have been trained now, that start doing it right away in your staff meeting. You're not using restorative justice. You're using a practice. You're using a talking piece to create a little bit of equity, and you're doing circle processes, and then people start saying, okay, now I get it, and they start using the language. What I saw, especially with consulting, is so many schools were like, yeah, we couldn't find the right case, or the first one didn't go well, and that keeps people from growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it puts so much pressure on the few big cases that you have, and then when it's not exactly successful, whatever success means in whoever's mind
right.
is determining that, right? Then it's like, oh, well, the whole thing none of it works.
Right.
And I just really emphasize that piece that you just said, that because that goes back to my point around the assumption around what a good outcome is or a success is, right? Yeah. And so I think people are going in with the intention of this amazing resolution happening, right? Like everybody's gonna be so happy with everything that happened. And you're like, no, that's not what's important. Actually, what's really important is, did we do this process well, right? Did people feel like they were heard in the process? Did everybody feel like they could say what they needed to say? Did they feel like their needs are being met, even if it's not how they thought that their needs should be met, right? Like, are we actually still able to meet their needs? Because we're not going to be able to give everybody what they want, right? Because somebody's going to come in here and they're going to say, I need this person to be fired. We all know that that's not going to happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if you're going in and you're letting them assume that that might be a possibility, you've already messed up at the start of your process, because we know that that's not a possibility, and you've set them up for failure because they're going in with assumptions. So we have to go through and set expectations, right? Doesn't mean nothing is impossible, but being clear that it's very unlikely. So what else can we do for you? What does this person being fired do for you? Well, I feel safe because they're not here. Excellent. Okay, so we're talking about safety. Great. Well, what else and what other ways what does safety look like? How else can we manifest safety for you with this person still being in the community? Well, okay, well, now they have to learn how to do X, Y, and Z, right? Or talking about the lens of, well, if we just move this person from this community and they've not learned, they're going to go to some other community and cause harm too. So if we just fire them, we're moving that harm elsewhere. So how can we keep them in this community, help them learn, and you feel safe? How can we do both of those things? So for me, it is that, again, it's that process becomes really important, and not this idea of a successful case, because sometimes you won't even get to the end. And even if you don't get to the end, there's still ways that people in the process can still feel like something good came from it if you never get to the agreement page. And I think that that's where we have to change our mentality too about these processes, that we don't always have to get to the very end for it to be, quote, a success.
There are multiple layers of needs that exist all along the way, and it is not the case that, like, if we don't meet all of them in which we never actually do,
right?
But like, if we can like manage expectations, I mean, I think that's so much of the process of like, okay, so if this happens in this way and that is their response, one, how are you going to feel? Like sitting in that space, imagine, and then like, what's going to be your next best, like, what's going to be the next best thing if you can't have that particular outcome. Some of the most powerful conversations I've been in are in those moments of like, where it's not the parties together, where it's just one of them, and we're having this conversation about, okay, like, what if this goes poorly? What if they don't respond with all kind of like, I'm sorry, and accountability and responsibility? How will that go for you? And then really exploring like the need. It's exploring needs, but just with different textures. This question from Kayla, thoughts about how to allow, and we've already been talking about some of this, but how to allow for openness, honesty, vulnerability, and connection amongst RJ processes that emphasize and allow participants to share experiences other than traumatic experiences, especially in communities of connection, not just processes addressing a specific harm.
Well, one thing I'll say right off the bat that's really helped me recently is, I could tell you, in 22 years of working in higher education at JMU, I never shared my struggles with other. No one knows that I've been to jail twice at JMU. I certainly don't write it on my resume. But now, I met y'all in an hour, and y'all know that, and I share it all the time. I think one of the most important things we can do, particularly with young model, that it's okay to struggle. It's okay to talk about how we've been harmed, how we've caused harm, those different things. Again, it's countering the social media that my life is great, my life is perfect, I'm going to all the parties, I'm doing it with perfect hair. I mean, that's the culture we're facing against. So when they hear the dean of students, well, and this isn't on my resume either, I graduated with a 2.1 GPA undergrad, I've been to jail twice, I transferred. They're like, wow. And now you're dean of students and you have a PhD, that it is possible to recover. I think, to me, one of the biggest things I've seen, and this is why I love when you do circle processes, that you role model it. If you're facilitating, if you have a round with a question, you role model being your authentic self and going deeper. And it's a challenge to do, especially when work environments and working with younger adults. So it's not easy to navigate, I would say. But I'd say only after 20 some years have I realized that I felt like I should have done it more.
Yeah, I would say, the vast majority of my circle work is going to be things that are not traumatic, right? They're going to just be community building, right? How do we get to know each other? And I will say that even though sometimes we might, so a couple things to think about is A, how are you allowing everybody to participate? So when you're thinking about the types of questions you're going to be asking, right? Are you ensuring that everybody can engage, right? Because sometimes that's where the traumatic stuff comes from. Because you might say something along the lines where you think it's simple, like a simple check-in question might be like, tell me where your favorite place to vacation is. Well, not everybody has an opportunity to vacation, and then that might pull up triggers or trauma or things around being the poor student in your classroom or things. So we have to be really mindful too about how we're asking questions or what questions we're asking when we are intending to be in that like low risk community building, relationship building place, because we may not intend for it to be traumatic. And yet, right, but also recognizing to Dr. Bacon's point is sometimes we don't know what people are experiencing. And so even in the most safe, because you are building this container of safety, of comfort, of whatever, that it just allows people to just whatever is kind of there, right? And so how do we create that sense of safety for people to be able to hold that, whatever that thing is for them? And then if you need to work on reverting it back to the kind of feel good, less traumatic, whatever, right? Oh my gosh, thank you so much for feeling comfortable in a space for all of us to be able to hear what you had to share, and feeling safe that you could share this. And let's all remind ourselves of our community agreements that we talked about confidentiality, and we're not going to share this when we leave this space. And so I would love to go back and really emphasize this positive thing or this non-traumatic thing as we continue the circle, right? And being able to bring it back to that. But I think, right, really whatever you need to be able to offer your community is what you offer. So if you want to be able to offer them a space to share their experiences without focusing on traumatic things, you just do that, right? But you just have to be mindful about how you're doing it, what questions you're asking, and how you're asking those questions.
And John, if I want to go back, I shared the story of the nursing student who came into my office. So she went through that pilot program and was journaling and mentoring and going through circle processes. I would say it was around week 5 of a 16-week program where we did a really good, powerful circle. And afterwards, I noticed her and 3 other students were crying, and they're waiting in line to talk to me. And they shared with each other, and she shared that her mom passed away during the semester. She was struggling and failed the class. She didn't tell anybody. I mean, can you imagine in a community? Of course, you're failing your classes and struggling, but it took, and again, it wasn't one circle of us sharing. It took 5 weeks of journaling, of one-on-one mentoring, and circle processes to her feel comfortable first telling a peer. So that to me is some of the powerful, and that's why I go back to that University of Vermont. Look at circles to build community, where you start doing that from day one, and you can start seeing that, oh, everybody is scared and nervous that first week, yet they're not sharing it, and over time, start sharing your authentic selves. It can have a really powerful effect on a community.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Kayla Schlenz had a question about what kept that support program from just being a pilot, and it actually, that program is what turned from a pilot into the rebound program at JMU. Is that correct, Josh? Yeah. So
yeah, it's still going on.
Yeah. So Kayla, feel free to check that out. It's the rebound program at JMU. That is what that the pilot program turned into. Well, as we kind of wind down our time together this afternoon, want to invite maybe each of you to share any closing thoughts or questions that have come up for you, maybe for each other, as we wind down.
Yeah, I think the thing that always comes up for me whenever I'm talking about restorative justice is sometimes, especially when you've been in it for a while, is that it could feel sometimes it feels like people are just saying the same thing over and over again. And it's like, yes, Yes, we are. And the reason is we keep harking back to certain pieces is that I think is that we lose it sometimes, right? And so I don't think anything that Josh or I have said today is like this groundbreaking, oh my gosh, aha moment. But sometimes it is just really important to practice the principles, right? That foundation, right? If you think about you playing sport, you've been out of it for a while, you always go back to the fundamentals, right? You got to make sure your fundamentals are really, really strong in order to be an outstanding basketball player, in order to be an outstanding, whatever sport it is you're doing. If your foundation is not good, it doesn't really matter if you have like, a quick 3-shot. Like it doesn't, that doesn't matter because you can only do that for so long, right? And then somebody's going to come block you. Somebody's going to get in your lane. All these different types of things are going to prevent you to be able to do that thing that you do really well if you don't have the other foundational pieces to support it. And so, yeah, it can feel good at first because you're like, ooh, I did that first one. I hit that layup. I don't know why I'm doing sportsman. Don't know where that came from. Maybe because it was NBA All-Star weekend and like now it's like stuck in my head.
There you go.
But like this idea of, I always harken back to really having the foundation be the absolute strongest it can be, because then you're able to build upon that and work off the cuff when you need to, because that's going to be really important, especially when you're engaging in these practices and you have to pivot sometimes, and it's really hard to pivot or make adjustments on the fly if the foundation isn't strong. And so I will always just emphasize that over and over and over and over and over again, is developing those fundamentals. Who am I in this process? How am I showing up? How does my physical appearance, my mental state, etc., impact what's happening in the circle, whether it's a community building circle, it's a harm circle, it's a trust, whatever it is. What's the container I'm trying to create? Why and for who? Right? Are we trying to build this container? What are the things in the container that might mess it up? And we need to either get it out or we need to bring something in. Also recognize the limitations of yourself. I know there's certain cases and things like that I should not be a facilitator for. Like, I just know that. Like, so I need to bring somebody else in, or I need to have a pair or partner who will help me, who can fill in the gaps that I don't have, right? And so just those types of things, I think, are just going to be important for us to always be reminded of the importance of our fundamentals.
Thank you for that, Desiree. Yeah, I love that. I guess for me, one of the things I think back when I was bringing restorative justice to JMU is I was also teaching an organizational theory class, and it was focused on organizational change. So it kept going through my mind of how do we, and one of the first steps of creating long-term organizational change is sense of urgency. And I remember very quickly, and looking at other institutions, there was never a sense of urgency for restorative justice to get it started. Especially at that time, it was after the Virginia Tech massacre, so it was risk management, it was avoiding litigation, it was managing the cases. It wasn't about making things right and the experiences for the students. That was, especially when you talk about dealing it with just high-level cases and major conflicts, there was no sense of urgency. But like Desiree just said, when you start just living restoratively or start using the practices, you'll see. And that's why what I've seen in training is you can't just talk about circles and tell them what it's like. You've got to experience it. And then if you experience it, and I've seen this with everyone, even long 20-year veterans of the law enforcement, wow, they're in tears. That was different. This is different. And when you start to do that day to day, you start to crave that experience. And that was the sense of urgency. And then, like John said, and then it was me telling stories. I would just tell stories of these experiences, and they were unbelievable. Talk about qualitative. The stories people who do restorative justice work have are amazing. And again, obviously confidentiality in that, but you can share the stories. And to me, right now, the culture, particularly in higher ed, it's anxiety and depression. And to me, that's a sense of urgency. Anyone who does this work in any administrative or even faculty capacity, that's what you spend your time working on. So it's hard to do the other stuff. I think restorative self-care and restorative practices has a role in this. So if you do the work and you help people see this is different, there is a sense of urgency. And when you start doing it individually and to build community and build within departments and teams and stuff, then you can start applying it to the higher level conflicts and things like that. So that would be my advice is to find that sense of urgency in a different way.
Yeah. Fidelity to where we started, to the and then and to the stories, and finding urgency in a different way, a different path to urgency.
Right.
I see we do have one last question about some suggestions of activities that you recommend for building community, for community building. Is there anything in particular that comes to mind? As we talk about, like, you can't repair a community that isn't already in existence.
I was trying not to talk first.
To me, I can't. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I think we've talked about it all the time. And some people on here might not know, but circle processes, a restorative practice. And again, you can look it up or go to training and different things of how to create that different type of space, that different type of container. And there's rooms. I don't know if we have time to go in all the details of what, like a centerpiece that can build a community in a special way and a special talking piece, and then using that practice. To me, that there's always team building and going to retreats and things like that. But what I like to call genuine community is long-term and being able to be more of our authentic selves. And I think one of the restorative practices of circles can really build that type of community. And if anyone in here doesn't know what it is, I'm sure there's resources or things you can go to learn more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit. I think one is doing check-in questions in time you're meeting with a group, especially if it's a consistent group. Engaging in developing community agreements, right? Like even the process of doing that. I recently did work with a teaching team at an institution because they were going in to teach a class that was about like racism. It's an anti-racist course, so that means they're going to be getting pushback sometimes around that. And so really we did our debrief, and they talked about how important it was for them to have done the community building agreement process and their expectations of the team before they did that, because as they faced those types of issues, they knew who their teaching team was, right? Like they knew that those people had their back because they had spent the time doing those agreements, setting those expectations, really understanding the perspective that everybody was kind of going into that work with. And so it made doing the work, even though it was really difficult, somewhat easier because they knew they had that support. And so sometimes doing that process of developing like what are your community guidelines or expectations as a collective body helps to really build relationships, because you're starting to understand the values of the people in the space with you. So that to me is crucial. I do that with all my classes, with my team, whatever. We're going to engage in that process. And then to Josh's point around doing circle practices, in either having small groups that are consistently together, if you can afford that in your time, to be able to do that as a collective, and then doing some large group sort of circle processes. But I would say anytime that you can engage in storytelling of some sort is how you're going to build community. So however you can engage in this, I'm just gonna say that one more time, however you can engage in storytelling is how you will build community.
Yeah. Thank you both for those pieces of wisdom, and for all of the wisdom that you've shared with us here on the webinar today. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Anderson and Dr. Bacon. And I'm going to invite Aaron to join us for some final announcements.
Yeah, thank you so much, Desiree and Josh, for inspiring us and sharing those insights, and definitely reminding us all how we can reflect on our internal experiences and day-to-day interactions in order to live more restoratively. And thanks, John, for guiding the conversation. Before we all move on with our days, just a little bit about our next webinar. You're invited to join us again on Wednesday, March 20th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for the topic Towards a Relational Masculinity, Restorative Justice in Response to Sexual Harms Perpetrated by Male-Identified People, with guests Kate Crozier, Carol Bilson, Sarah Scanlon, and Jude Udshorn, and host Jonathan Swartz. They'll be exploring the intersection of themes of sexual harm and masculinity in restorative justice work. We hope that you'll join us again for what is sure to be a very significant conversation. You are also encouraged to check out our website for our archive of webinars exploring restorative justice themes from the last 12 years, and to keep up to date with other events and resources of the Zehr Institute. As always, we're incredibly grateful for your partnership, and we welcome your involvement in the work that we do. Thank you for spending your time with us today, and take care, everyone.